My name's Adam, and for most of my life, I thought I had it all. I was a military veteran who had transitioned into running a successful family business in Boston. My wife, Emily, managed our finances like a pro, and my brother, Jake, took charge of sales. We were more than just colleagues, we were family, inseparable. Together, we built something solid, a close-knit team that felt unbreakable. At home, Emily and I had a daughter, Sophie, the light of my life. She was just starting high school and had the kind of vibrant, unyielding spirit that made me incredibly proud. Between work and family, my life felt like it had fallen into place perfectly. I had no reason to suspect that anything was amiss. Looking back now, I realized there were signs, little cracks in the foundation I was too blind, or too trusting, to see. Emily seemed more distant at times, and Jake often worked late for no apparent reason. But I chalked it up to the pressures of running a business and raising a family. It never crossed my mind that something so devastating could be happening right under my nose. It all started on a Thursday evening, one of those unremarkable nights when you expect nothing out of the ordinary. Sophie was upstairs studying, and I had just come home from a client meeting. Emily and Jake were still at the office, supposedly working late on some sales reports. I didn't think much of it, working late was common in our line of business. But as I sat in the living room, something gnawed at me. I couldn't put my finger on it, just a sense that things weren't adding up. Jake had been working late far too often recently, and Emily seemed unusually defensive when I asked her about their progress. It was subtle, too subtle for me to act on at first. Still, I felt compelled to swing by the office, partly to check on them and partly to reassure myself that everything was fine. When I arrived, the office was dark except for the faint glow of light spilling from the conference room. As I got closer, I heard murmurs, low voices, too soft to make out words but unmistakably intimate. My heart sank, the kind of sinking that makes your stomach twist into knots. I stood frozen outside the door, trying to convince myself I was overthinking it. But then, I heard Emily laugh, a soft, playful laugh I hadn't heard in years. Jake said something in response, too low for me to catch, but Emily's reply hit me like a freight train, "I've missed this so much." Time seemed to stop. My chest tightened, and my mind raced, searching for an explanation that didn't lead to the obvious conclusion. Maybe they were just reminiscing about something innocent. Maybe this wasn't what it sounded like. But deep down, I already knew the truth. I stepped closer, my pulse pounding in my ears, and peered through the small gap in the door. What I saw shattered me. Emily and Jake were standing close, too close, and her hand rested on his arm in a way that felt far too familiar. Their body language, their tone, it was intimate in a way no siblings-in-law should ever be. Still, I didn't burst in. Instead, I left as quietly as I had come, my mind a whirlwind of emotions, shock, disbelief, rage, and pain. I drove aimlessly for what felt like hours, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. The images played on a loop in my head, each time cutting deeper. When I finally pulled into our driveway, I sat in the car, staring at the house where my daughter was sound asleep, oblivious to the storm brewing just beneath the surface. I felt betrayed, humiliated, and broken. The life I thought I had, the trust one placed in the two people closest to me, was a lie. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them together, heard her laugh, and felt the sting of betrayal all over again. I knew I couldn't let this slide, but I also knew I needed to tread carefully. My business, my family, my daughter's stability, everything was on the line. By morning, one thing was clear, I needed proof. Without it, Emily could deny everything, twist the narrative, and make me look like a paranoid fool. So I resolved to uncover the full truth, no matter how painful it might be. The next morning, I woke up with a plan. The shock of what I'd seen the night before was still raw, but beneath the pain was a new determination. I wasn't going to confront Emily or Jake until I had hard evidence, proof they couldn't explain away. If I was going to unravel the web of lies they'd spun around me, I needed to be smart. First, I checked Emily's phone while she was in the shower. My hands were shaking as I opened her messages. There it was, a thread with Jake, buried under a few work-related chats. At first, it seemed innocent enough, details about sales leads and client meetings. But the deeper I scrolled, the clearer it became. Their tone shifted, moving from professional to personal, then to something else entirely. Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again. My breath caught in my throat. There was no way to misinterpret that. Message after message painted the same picture, meetups disguised as work sessions, shared hotel bookings, and exchanges that went beyond casual flirtation. As painful as it was to read, I took screenshots of everything and sent them to my email. My heart pounded with every swipe, as though I might get caught at any moment. When I was done, I locked the phone and put it back where I'd found it, then sat on the edge of the bed, staring into space. But that wasn't enough. I needed something even more concrete. So, I reached out to a friend of mine, Eric, who had served with me in the military and now ran a private investigation firm. I hated dragging him into this mess, but I trusted him to be discreet. Eric didn't ask too many questions, just nodded and said, "I'll take care of it." Within a few hours, he had placed discreet surveillance at the office and started digging into Emily and Jake's financial activities. Days turned into a blur as I waited for Eric's updates. Every moment felt like a test of my patience, my strength, and my ability to keep my emotions in check. At home, I acted as though everything was fine, even though every glance at Emily made my stomach churn. At work, I pretended to be oblivious, even as Jake grinned at me like nothing was wrong. When Eric finally called, his tone was grim. "Adam, I've got something you need to see," he said. I met him later that evening at his office, where he laid it all out for me. Photos, timestamps, and videos, all the proof I needed. Eric had caught them together on multiple occasions, sneaking off to a nearby hotel during work hours. One image, in particular, broke me, Emily and Jake, hand in hand, laughing like teenagers in love. "This isn't just an affair," Eric said carefully. "There's something else." I checked the company accounts, and it looks like Jake's been skimming money for months, maybe years. He's been funneling funds into a personal account. My head spun. Not only had they betrayed me personally, but Jake had also been stealing from the business I'd built with my own hands. The rage I felt was indescribable, a burning, consuming fire that made me want to storm into the office and tear everything apart. But I didn't. I took a deep breath and reminded myself that I needed to stay focused. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about protecting my daughter, my livelihood, and my future. I would confront them, but I would do it on my terms, with all the facts in my hands. The moment finally came on a quiet Friday evening. Sophie was staying over at a friend's house, so I had the space I needed to confront Emily without worrying about her overhearing. I sat at the kitchen table, the evidence I'd gathered spread out in front of me, screenshots of text messages, photos from Eric's investigation, and documents proving Jake's embezzlement. It felt like I was preparing for battle. When Emily walked in, she seemed surprised to find me sitting there. "You're home early," she said casually, dropping her purse onto the counter. "We need to talk," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. She froze for a second, then tried to brush it off. "Can it wait? I've had a long day." "No, Emily," I cut her off. "It can't wait." The tone of my voice must have tipped her off because she sat down across from me, her expression guarded. For a moment, I just stared at her, wondering how she could sit there so calmly when everything between us had been a lie. I started slowly, laying the screenshots on the table. "I know about you and Jake," I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside me. Her face went pale, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. "Adam, it's not what you think," she began, but I held up my hand to stop her. "Don't," I said. Don't insult me by pretending this is something it's not. I have proof, Emily. I've seen the texts, the photos, everything. So don't lie to me. Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I thought she might actually apologize. Instead, she shifted to anger. Why were you spying on me? How could you invade my privacy like that? I laughed bitterly. Privacy? Are you serious right now? You've been sneaking around behind my back for years, and you want to talk about privacy? Her defenses crumbled then, and she started crying in earnest. I didn't mean for it to happen, she said, her voice trembling. It just did. Jake was there for me when you weren't, Anne. When I wasn't. I interrupted, my voice rising. Do you have any idea how much I've sacrificed for this family? For you. And you repay me by sleeping with my brother? She looked down, unable to meet my eyes. I'm sorry, she whispered, but the words felt hollow, meaningless. Sorry doesn't fix this, Emily, I said, standing up and pacing the room. Do you even understand what you've done? You didn't just betray me, you betrayed Sophie, our family, and the business we built together. And Jake, he's been stealing from the company on top of everything else. Her head snapped up at that, her eyes widening. Stealing? What are you talking about? I threw the financial documents onto the table. Jake's been embezzling money. Thousands of dollars, maybe more. Did you know about that too? No, she said quickly, shaking her head. I swear, Adam, I didn't know. I never wanted any of this to happen. I was stupid, and I made a mistake, but I didn't know he was stealing. I wanted to believe her, but at that moment, it didn't matter. The damage was done. I'm filing for divorce, I said, my voice cold and final. You're out of the house by the end of the week, and you're done at the company. As for Jake, I'll deal with him separately. But you and we're finished. Her tears turned into sobs, but I didn't stay to listen. I walked out of the room, leaving her to sit with the weight of what she'd done. Upstairs, I shut the door to my bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, my head in my hands. The confrontation was over, but the fallout had just begun. If confronting Emily was hard, facing Jake felt like stepping into a war zone. Unlike Emily, who at least showed some level of remorse, I didn't expect an ounce of regret from him. Jake had always been cocky, quick to deflect blame, and I knew this wouldn't be any different. The next morning, I drove to the office early, determined to confront him before anyone else arrived. The building was quiet, the hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound as I walked into the conference room where Jake sat sipping coffee. He greeted me with his usual grin, the same smug smile he'd worn for years, only now, it made my blood boil. Hey, Adam, he said, leaning back in his chair. What's up? I shut the door behind me and locked it. We need to talk. Jake raised an eyebrow but didn't move. Sounds serious. It is, I said, tossing the stack of evidence onto the table in front of him. I know about you and Emily. The grin vanished, replaced by a mask of indifference. He didn't even look at the papers. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't play dumb, Jake, I snapped, my voice rising. I have the texts, the photos, and proof of every hotel you snuck off to during work hours. You think you're going to lie your way out of this? For a moment, he just stared at me, his jaw tightening. Then, to my surprise, he leaned forward, his tone cold and sharp. All right, fine. You caught us. But don't act like some saint, Adam. You've been so busy running the company and playing hero that you forgot to pay attention to your own wife. His words hit a nerve, but I refused to let him see it. Don't you dare put this on me, I said, slamming my fist on the table. You didn't just betray me as your brother, you stole from the company. You think I don't know about the embezzlement? You've been lining your pockets while I work to keep this business alive. His eyes flickered, a crack in his otherwise confident demeanor. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I grabbed the financial documents and shoved them toward him. "Here's what I'm talking about. I've already handed this over to the FBI. You're done, Jake. You're out of the company, and when this is over, you'll be lucky if you're not sitting in a jail cell." "You'd really do this to your own brother," he hissed, his face twisting with anger. "You stopped being my brother the moment you slept with my wife," I said, my voice cold. "And if you think I'm going to let you ruin everything I've worked for, you're out of your damn mind." For the first time, Jake looked shaken. He stood up, towering over me, but I didn't back down. "You're making a mistake, Adam," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You'll regret this." "No," I said, meeting his gaze. "The only thing I regret is trusting you." I walked out of the room, leaving him there with the evidence of his betrayal spread out before him. As I headed back to my office, I felt a strange mix of emotions, anger, relief, and a deep sadness for what had been lost. Jake was no longer my brother in any meaningful sense. Whatever bond we'd shared growing up had been shattered, replaced by a bitter resentment that I knew would never heal. But as painful as it was, I also felt a sense of closure. I had taken the first step toward reclaiming my life. Now, it was time to protect what mattered most, my daughter and the future we still had ahead of us. After confronting Jake, I knew the next step was the most important, protecting Sophie. She was the one innocent person caught in the crossfire of this nightmare, and I couldn't let her get hurt any more than she had to be. My priority was shielding her from the fallout and making sure she knew she still had at least one parent she could rely on. That weekend, I sat down with her in the living room. Sophie was curled up on the couch with her phone, her bright smile lighting up the room. It pained me to think of how her world would soon change, but I knew I couldn't keep her in the dark forever. "Hey, sweetheart," I began, trying to keep my tone steady. "Can we talk for a bit?" She looked up, immediately sensing something was wrong. "What's going on, Dad?" I took a deep breath, my hands clasped tightly together. "There's something I need to tell you. It's about your mom and your Uncle Jake." Her brow furrowed, and she set her phone down. "What about them?" I hesitated, unsure how to say it without breaking her heart. But I'd promised myself I would be honest with her. "Your mom and Jake, they've been having an affair. I found out recently, and I've decided to file for divorce." For a moment, Sophie just stared at me, as if she hadn't heard me correctly. Then, her face crumpled, and tears welled up in her eyes. "An affair? Mom and Uncle Jake," she whispered, her voice cracking. I nodded, my own heart breaking as I watched her process the news. "I'm so sorry, sophomore. I wish I didn't have to tell you this, but I didn't want you to find out some other way." She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as she cried. I moved closer, wrapping my arms around her. "It's okay to be upset," I said softly. "This isn't your fault, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you're okay." "How could they do this?" she sobbed. "To you? To us?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice heavy. "But what I do know is that I'm here for you, no matter what. We'll get through this together." We sat like that for a long time, her tears soaking into my shirt as I held her. Eventually, she pulled back, wiping her eyes. "What's going to happen now?" "Well," I said, choosing my words carefully, "your mom is moving out, and Jake won't be around the business anymore. Things are going to be different, but I'm going to do everything I can to keep life as normal as possible for you." "Is this why Mom's been acting so weird lately?" she asked, her voice small. "Probably," I said. "She's made some choices that hurt all of us, but that doesn't change how much I love you or how much I want to protect you." Sophie nodded, her expression hardening. "I don't think I want to see her for a while." "That's okay," I said gently. "You can decide how you want to handle this, and I'll support you." In the days that followed, I focused on creating a stable environment for Sophie. I took over the daily routines Emily used to handle, made sure she had someone to talk to, whether it was me or a therapist, and gave her space to process everything in her own time. She was stronger than I'd ever realized. Despite her pain, Sophie threw herself into school and her friends, finding ways to distract herself from the chaos. Watching her resilience gave me strength, too. I couldn't change what had happened, but I could fight to ensure that Sophie knew she wasn't alone in this. She was my rock, just as much as I was hers, and together we began to rebuild the pieces of our lives. The day Emily moved out was surreal. After nearly 15 years of marriage, watching her pack up her things and leave felt like a chapter of my life being torn out and discarded. I thought I'd feel relieved, but all I felt was a hollow ache. As much as she'd betrayed me, there was still a part of me that mourned the family we used to be, or at least the family I thought we were. Emily had begged to stay, pleading for forgiveness and promising she could fix things, but I wasn't having it. Her betrayal was a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and any hope of reconciliation had been obliterated the moment I uncovered her affair. We agreed to keep things civil for Sophie's sake. She'd move into a small apartment a few miles away, and I'd have primary custody. It wasn't what I wanted for Sophie, but it was the best I could do under the circumstances. When the moving day arrived, Emily came by early in the morning with a rental truck. She tried to avoid eye contact with me as she carried boxes to the truck, but every now and then, she'd glance my way, her face a mix of guilt and regret. I didn't offer to help. Instead, I stayed in the kitchen, sipping coffee and keeping an eye on the clock. Sophie had chosen to stay at a friend's house that day, unwilling to be around for the move. I couldn't blame her. She hadn't spoken to Emily since I told her about the affair, and every mention of her mom seemed to bring fresh anger to the surface. When Emily finished packing the last box, she hesitated in the doorway. "Adam," she said quietly, her voice trembling. I looked up but didn't say anything. "I'm so sorry for everything," she continued. "I never wanted it to end like this. I know I hurt you and Sophie, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life." Her words hung in the air, but they felt hollow. I searched her face for any sign of the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago, but all I saw was a stranger. "I hope you mean that," I said finally. "For Sophie's sake, I hope you do better from here on out." She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I'll call Sophie later. I hope one day she can forgive me." I didn't respond. Forgiveness wasn't something I could force, and right now, it felt like an impossibility for both of us. Emily gave me one last look before walking out the door, closing it softly behind her. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where she'd been. That evening, when Sophie came home, the house felt quieter, emptier. She looked around and asked, "Is she gone?" "Yes," I said. Sophie nodded, her expression unreadable. Then she sat down beside me on the couch, leaning her head on my shoulder. "We're going to be okay, right?" she asked softly. "We are," I promised, wrapping an arm around her. "We'll figure it out, one step at a time." And for the first time in weeks, I felt like that promise was one I could keep. After Emily moved out, it was time to handle Jake. The betrayal had already cost me my marriage, but his embezzlement threatened the business I had spent years building. I wasn't just angry, I was determined to make sure he paid for what he'd done. The day I fired him was a turning point. I called him into the office under the guise of discussing sales strategies. He walked in with his usual smugness, like he didn't have a care in the world. Watching him act as if nothing had happened made my blood boil. "Take a seat," I said, motioning to the chair across from my desk. Jake leaned back casually, clearly not sensing what was about to come. "So, what's this about?" I didn't waste time. "You're done here, Jake," I said, sliding the financial documents across the desk. "This is proof of the money you've been stealing from the company." I've already reported it to the FBI. They'll be contacting you soon. His expression shifted instantly from cocky to defensive. What the hell are you talking about, Adam? This is ridiculous. Don't even try to deny it, I snapped. I've got the evidence. Bank records, fake invoices, it's all here. You've been stealing from me, from this company, and you thought you could get away with it. He leaned forward, his face darkening. You don't want to do this, Adam. You think you're the only one who's suffered. You think you're some saint. I've been busting my ass for this business, and maybe I thought I deserved a little more than you were giving me. Deserved more? I repeated, incredulous. You betrayed me, stole from me, and destroyed our family. You don't deserve anything. Jake stood up, his hands clenched into fists. You're going to regret this, he hissed. No, Jake, I said calmly, meeting his glare. You're the one who's going to regret it. Don't bother coming back to this office. You're fired, and if I see you here again, I'll call the police. He stormed out, slamming the door so hard it rattled the walls. I sat there for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. The confrontation was over, but the consequences were just beginning. Later that week, the FBI contacted me to discuss Jake's embezzlement. I provided everything I had, records, emails, Eric's findings. The agents assured me they'd pursue the case, and I felt a small sense of vindication. Justice might not undo the damage, but at least Jake would face the consequences of his actions. As news of Jake's firing spread through the office, I made it clear to the team that I wouldn't tolerate dishonesty. The business had been shaken, but I was determined to rebuild trust and move forward. At home, Sophie asked about Jake, her voice tinged with hesitation. What's going to happen to Uncle Jake? I sighed, unsure how much to tell her. He made some bad decisions, sophomore decisions that hurt a lot of people, including us. He's going to have to deal with the consequences. Good, she said firmly, surprising me with her resolve. He deserves it. I nodded, grateful for her strength. Sophie was my anchor through all of this, and together, we were slowly finding our way through the wreckage. Jake was gone from my life, and Emily was out of the house. The slate was far from clean, but at least I had a chance to rebuild, and I wasn't going to waste it. With Jake gone, I faced the daunting task of stabilizing the business. The betrayal had shaken more than just my personal life, it had left a mess of financial irregularities and a fractured team. Trust had been broken, not just between me and Jake, but within the company itself. Employees whispered about the scandal, and morale was at an all-time low. I knew I needed to act quickly to restore faith in both me and the business. The first step was a company-wide meeting. I called everyone into the conference room, determined to address the situation head-on. Thank you all for coming, I began, standing at the front of the room. I scanned the faces of my employees, some looked worried, others confused. I want to be transparent about what's been going on. As many of you know, Jake is no longer with the company. He betrayed not just me, but all of you, by stealing from the business and compromising our integrity. A murmur ran through the room, but I held up my hand to silence it. I know this has been a difficult time, and I understand if some of you feel unsure about the future. But I want to make one thing very clear, this company will move forward. I'm committed to rebuilding trust, ensuring accountability, and making this a place we can all be proud of again. I outlined the changes I plan to implement, including stricter financial oversight and regular audits to prevent anything like this from happening again. I also announced that Hannah, my loyal office manager, would be stepping into a more prominent role to help manage day-to-day operations. Her dedication and honesty had been a beacon of stability throughout the chaos, and I trusted her implicitly. After the meeting, several employees approached me, thanking me for my honesty in offering their support. It was a small step, but it felt like a victory. Rebuilding the business wasn't just about numbers and policies, it was about repairing relationships. I made it a point to meet with each team individually, listening to their concerns and ideas for improvement. Slowly but surely, the atmosphere began to shift. People started to smile again, and the whispers of doubt were replaced by cautious optimism. At home, Sophie noticed the change in me. "You seem different," she said one evening as we ate dinner. "Different how?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Like, more confident," she said with a small smile. "Like you've got a plan." I nodded, realizing she was right. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was in control again. "I do have a plan," I said. "It's not going to be easy, but we're going to get through this. All of it." That night, as I reviewed financial reports and brainstormed new strategies, I felt a flicker of hope. The business was far from perfect, but it was mine, and I wasn't going to let Jake's betrayal define its future, or mine. In the weeks following Jake's departure, the office started to regain its rhythm, but the process of rebuilding wasn't just about policies and meetings, it was about finding strength in the people who remained loyal to me and the company. One of those people was Hannah, my office manager. Hannah had been with the business since the early days, and she'd always been the kind of person you could rely on. While Jake and Emily had been busy betraying me, she had quietly held the fort together, stepping in wherever needed, making sure things didn't completely fall apart. After the chaos of the scandal, it became clear just how invaluable she was. She wasn't just efficient, she cared. About the company, about the people who worked there, and, surprisingly, about me. One evening, long after most of the office had gone home, I found her still at her desk, typing away with a focused expression. "Hannah," I said, leaning against the doorframe of her office, "you've been putting in a lot of extra hours lately." She looked up and gave me a tired smile. "Someone has to make sure this place doesn't burn to the ground," she said lightly, though her tone carried a hint of weariness. I stepped into the room and sat across from her. "I mean it, Hannah. You've been incredible through all of this. I don't know how I would have managed without you." She shrugged, her cheeks turning slightly pink. "It's my job, Adam. And honestly, I care about this place as much as you do. I want to see it succeed." For a moment, we sat in comfortable silence, the hum of her computer the only sound in the room. Then, almost without thinking, I said, "You've been more than just an employee, you know. You've been a friend. And right now, I need all the friends I can get." Her expression softened, and she leaned back in her chair. "You're a good person, Adam. You've been dealt a terrible hand, but the way you're handling it, it says a lot about your character." I felt a lump in my throat, her words hitting harder than I expected. After everything I'd been through, Emily's betrayal, Jake's deceit, the turmoil at home, it was easy to feel like I'd lost pieces of myself along the way. Hearing someone I respected acknowledge my efforts felt like a balm on an open wound. As the days turned into weeks, Hannah became an even more integral part of my life. She wasn't just my right hand at work, she was someone I could talk to, someone who understood the weight I was carrying. She never pried or offered unsolicited advice, but her presence was steady, grounding. One afternoon, during a rare break from work, she knocked on my office door holding 2 cups of coffee. "You look like you could use this," she said, setting one on my desk. I smiled, taking a sip. "You're not wrong." She sat down across from me, her gaze thoughtful. "You know, Adam, I think you're stronger than you give yourself credit for." "Some days, I don't feel strong at all," I admitted. "Some days, I feel like I'm barely holding it together." "That's the thing about strength," she said. "It's not about never falling apart, it's about putting the pieces back together and keeping on. And you're doing that." Her words stayed with me long after she left the room. In a world that had been turned upside down, Hannah was a reminder that not everyone would betray me, that there were still people I could trust. At home, Sophie noticed the shift in my mood. "You've been smiling more," she said one evening as we watched a movie together. "Have I?" I asked, surprised. Yeah, she said, snuggling into my side. It's nice. You deserve to be happy, Dad. Her words brought a lump to my throat, and I hugged her tightly. You know what, Soph? So do you. And I promise, we're going to get there. Together. Little by little, I was finding strength in the people around me. Sophie, with her resilience and unwavering support, and Hannah, with her quiet determination and unshakable loyalty. It wasn't the life I'd envisioned, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like a life worth fighting for. As the weeks turned into months, the dust began to settle. The business was stabilizing, Sophie was finding her rhythm at school, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could take a breath without feeling like my world was collapsing around me. But rebuilding wasn't just about putting the pieces back together, it was about figuring out what I wanted my life to look like moving forward. I was no longer the husband I had been, nor the man who blindly trusted the people closest to him. I was different now, tougher in some ways, more cautious in others. Hannah, as always, was a constant presence. She wasn't just helping at work, she'd quietly become a part of my and Sophie's daily life. She'd drop off notes from the office when I worked from home or bring Sophie her favorite snacks when she stopped by. Her kindness never felt forced, just genuine, like she truly cared about us. One evening, as Sophie and I were finishing dinner, Hannah stopped by with a stack of papers for me to review. I figured you'd want to see these before tomorrow's meeting, she said, handing them over with a smile. Thanks, I said, setting them aside. But you didn't have to bring them all the way here. I was in the neighborhood, she said with a shrug. Besides, I needed an excuse to check in on you too. Sophie perked up at that. You should stay for dessert. Dad bought way too much pie, and there's no way we can finish it ourselves. Hannah hesitated, but Sophie didn't give her much of a choice. Come on, you've earned it. With a laugh, Hannah relented. She joined us at the table, and for the next hour, the three of us talked and laughed like old friends. Sophie told her stories about school, and I found myself smiling more than I had in weeks. After Sophie went to bed, Hannah and I lingered in the kitchen, sipping coffee and talking about everything and nothing. At one point, she looked at me, her expression thoughtful. You're doing a good job, you know, she said. Doing a good job at what? I asked, genuinely curious. At being a dad, she said. At keeping it together, even when everything's been so hard. Her words touched something deep inside me, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Finally, I said, I don't think I could have done it without you, Hannah. You've been more of a help than you realize. She smiled softly, her eyes meeting mine. That's what friends are for. But the way she said it, the way her gaze lingered just a little too long, hinted at something more. I didn't press it, though. I wasn't sure if I was ready for anything beyond what we had, but in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, hope. As Hannah left that night, I watched her walk down the driveway, a warmth spreading through me that I couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the relief of knowing I wasn't alone, or maybe it was the realization that, even after all the heartbreak, there was still room for something good. Whatever it was, it felt like the beginning of something new, something I wasn't sure I deserved but was willing to embrace. As time passed, the scars of betrayal began to fade, but healing wasn't a straight line. There were days when the weight of everything, Emily's affair, Jake's theft, the upheaval in our lives, felt suffocating. But there were also moments of clarity and growth, times when I felt like I was finally finding my footing again. One of the hardest parts of moving forward was dealing with the residual anger. It wasn't just directed at Emily and Jake but also at myself. How had I missed the signs? How had I allowed myself to be so blind to what was happening right under my nose? These questions haunted me, replaying in my mind during quiet moments. Therapy became a lifeline. At first, I was reluctant to go. Talking about my feelings, especially with a stranger, felt like admitting weakness. But Sophie convinced me. "You're always telling me it's okay to ask for help, Dad," she said one evening as we talked. "Maybe it's time to take your own advice." Her words struck a chord. If I wanted Sophie to grow up knowing it was okay to be vulnerable, I had to model that for her. So I found a therapist and started going weekly. In those sessions, I unpacked years of guilt, frustration, and grief. My therapist helped me see that I wasn't responsible for the choices Emily and Jake had made. Their betrayal said more about them than it did about me. Slowly, I began to let go of the blame I'd been carrying. Sophie was going through her own healing process. While she didn't want to see Emily, she couldn't avoid her entirely. Emily called often, begging to meet, but Sophie always refused. One day, after weeks of Emily's persistence, Sophie asked me, "Do you think I should talk to her?" I hesitated, not wanting to sway her decision. "That's up to you, sophomore. If you think it would help, then maybe it's worth considering. But if you're not ready, that's okay too. Don't let her pressure you into anything." After a long pause, she said, "I think I need to hear her side. I don't know if I'll forgive her, but I want to understand why." I supported her decision, even though it made my stomach twist to think of Sophie confronting Emily. They met in a neutral space, and Sophie later told me the conversation was emotional but not as cathartic as she'd hoped. Emily apologized repeatedly, but Sophie said she felt the apologies were more about easing Emily's guilt than genuinely making amends. "She said she's sorry, but it doesn't change what she did," Sophie told me afterward. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive her, and that's okay." Hearing her say that filled me with pride. Sophie was stronger than I'd ever imagined, and watching her navigate this situation with grace and maturity reminded me of how resilient she was. Meanwhile, at work, things were starting to feel stable again. The new systems we'd implemented were running smoothly, and the team was more cohesive than ever. Hannah was a big part of that. She'd stepped into her new role with confidence and had become my sounding board for both professional and personal matters. One evening, after a particularly productive day at the office, I invited her out for dinner as a thank you for everything she'd done. It wasn't anything fancy, just a casual meal at a local diner, but it felt significant. Over plates of comfort food, we talked about the journey we'd been on over the past year. "You've come a long way, Adam," Hannah said, her tone warm. "I'm not just talking about the business. You're a different person than you were when all of this started." "Better or worse?" I asked with a small smile. "Better," she said without hesitation. "Stronger. More focused. You've been through hell, but you've come out on the other side." I looked at her, struck by how much her presence had meant to me. "I couldn't have done it without you, Hannah. You've been my rock through all of this." She smiled, a hint of something unspoken in her expression. "You didn't need me, Adam. You just needed to remember how strong you already were. I was just here to remind you." That night, as I walked her to her car, I felt something shift. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic moment, just a quiet understanding between us. Healing wasn't just about letting go of the past, it was about embracing what lay ahead. When I returned home, Sophie was waiting up for me. "How was dinner?" she asked, a knowing look on her face. "Good," I said, ruffling her hair. "Really good." For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like I was finally on solid ground. The wounds were still there, but they were healing. And for the first time, I truly believed the best was yet to come. The months rolled by, and life began to feel normal again, though a different kind of normal. It wasn't the life I'd envisioned a year ago, but it was one I was learning to appreciate. The business was thriving, Sophie was flourishing in school, and for the first time in years, I felt at peace. Hannah and I continued to grow closer, though we didn't put a label on what was happening between us. It wasn't about rushing into something, it was about allowing things to unfold naturally. She'd become a part of Sophie's life in small but meaningful ways, helping with homework when I was stuck at work, showing up to cheer her on at school events, and just being there. One Friday evening, after another busy week, Hannah came over for dinner. It had become something of a tradition, these casual meals at home, where we'd talk and laugh and simply enjoy each other's company. Sophie adored her, and their easy rapport only made me appreciate Hannah more. After Sophie went to bed, Hannah and I stayed on the back porch, the summer air warm and filled with the hum of crickets. She was sitting on the bench swing, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, while I leaned against the railing, looking out at the yard. "You've done an incredible job with Sophie," she said after a while. "She's such a great kid. You should be proud." "I am," I said, smiling. "But a lot of that is her. She's stronger than I ever realized." "Wonder where she gets that from," Hannah teased, her eyes twinkling. I chuckled. "I think we've both been through enough to learn how to handle life's curveballs." There was a pause, a comfortable silence stretching between us. Then she said something that caught me off guard. "Do you ever think about starting over?" I turned to look at her, unsure of what she meant. "What do you mean?" She glanced down at her mug, then back up at me. "I mean, after everything you've been through, do you ever think about what it would be like to open your heart again? To let someone in?" Her question lingered in the air, and I felt my chest tighten. It wasn't that I hadn't thought about it, I had. But admitting it, even to myself, felt like stepping into uncharted territory. "I do," I said finally, my voice quiet. "It's scary, though. After what happened with Emily, it's hard to imagine trusting someone like that again." She nodded, her expression soft. "It's scary, but it's also worth it. You deserve happiness, Adam. You've worked so hard to rebuild your life. Maybe it's time to start thinking about what you want for the future, not just for Sophie, but for yourself." Her words hit me harder than I expected. For so long, my focus had been on survival, on keeping the business afloat, protecting Sophie, and holding everything together. But she was right. I couldn't spend the rest of my life looking backward, consumed by what I'd lost. I sat down beside her on the swing, the bench creaking slightly under our weight. "You've been there for me through all of this, Hannah," I said. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to thank you enough." "You don't have to thank me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here because I care. About you, about Sophie. About this life you're building." Her words hung between us, and I felt something shift, an unspoken understanding that we were no longer just colleagues or friends. We were something more, even if neither of us was ready to put it into words. That night, after she left, I sat on the porch alone, staring up at the stars. For the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of excitement for the future. Change was hard, but it was also necessary. I wasn't just rebuilding my life, I was beginning to imagine a new one. One filled with hope, love, and the possibility of happiness. A year after everything fell apart, life looked completely different, better, fuller, and more meaningful than I ever could have imagined. The wounds of betrayal, while still faintly visible, had healed into scars that no longer defined me. Instead, they served as reminders of the strength it took to rebuild. The business was thriving, thanks to the new systems and team we had in place. Employees who once doubted the company's future were now fully invested, and the culture had transformed into one of transparency and trust. Hannah had stepped seamlessly into her expanded role, managing operations with a level of care and dedication that inspired everyone around her. But the most important transformation wasn't at work, it was at home. Sophie had blossomed over the past year, her resilience shining brighter than ever. She was excelling in school, had joined the debate team, and was even talking about colleges, something that felt far too soon for me as her dad. She still struggled with her relationship with Emily, choosing to keep her distance for now. But she had come to terms with her decision, and I supported her completely. Hannah had become an integral part of our lives. At first, she was simply a friend, someone who provided stability and kindness when we needed it most. But over time, that friendship deepened into something undeniable. One evening, after dinner, Sophie sat down beside me on the couch with a sly smile. "So, when are you going to ask Hannah out?" I nearly choked on my drink. "What? Come on, Dad," she said, rolling her eyes. "It's obvious. You like her, she likes you, and she's practically family already. What are you waiting for?" I opened my mouth to argue, but the truth was, she wasn't wrong. Hannah and I had grown close, and the feelings I had for her were impossible to ignore. A few weeks later, I finally worked up the courage to take Sophie's advice. I invited Hannah over for dinner, just the two of us. She seemed surprised but agreed, and when she arrived, she looked nervous in a way that made me smile. We ate, talked, and laughed, as we always did. But this time, as we sat together on the back porch, I decided to take a leap of faith. "Hannah," I said, my heart pounding, "I need to tell you something." She looked at me, her eyes soft and searching. "What is it?" I took a deep breath. "You've been such an important part of my life this past year. You've been there for Sophie and me when we needed it most, and I don't know how I would have gotten through everything without you. But it's more than that. I care about you, more than I ever expected to care about anyone again." Her expression shifted, a mixture of surprise and warmth. "Adam," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I've felt the same way for a long time. I just didn't know if you were ready." "I am," I said firmly. "For the first time in a long time, I feel ready to let someone in again. And I want it to be you." Tears filled her eyes as she smiled. "I want that too." That night, as we sat under the stars, holding hands and talking about everything and nothing, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. It wasn't just the start of a new relationship, it was the start of a new chapter, one filled with hope, love, and endless possibilities. Over the following months, Hannah became not just my partner but Sophie's confidant and friend. The three of us built a life together, one rooted in trust and shared dreams. Looking back, I realized that the betrayal I had endured wasn't the end of my story, it was the beginning of something better. It forced me to grow, to reassess my priorities, and to embrace the people who truly cared about me. Life was far from perfect, but it was real, and it was mine. For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be.